really quickly. Authors like Mark Hauser have suggested that there is a universal grammar of morality. I was wondering what your thoughts are on that, and if you think there's a sort of innate notion of human rights that we have.
Well, I think the answer has to be yes, for reasons that David Hume discussed. It wasn't just Adam Smith who had smart things to say. Scottish Enlightenment was a great place. If I had a choice to go somewhere, it would be Scotland in the late 18th century. But Hume wrote about this. He put it in different terms than we would use. But he pointed out that humans have the capacity to make moral judgments in new situations in ways that conform to the understanding of others. And he says the only way in which this is possible is if there are principles that are part of our nature. They're, in his terms, they're instincts, meaning part of our nature. He said these are different from the animal instincts that we share with other animals, like obvious ones. So we have some kind of instincts that are an original part of our nature, and these somehow yield judgments in novel situations which are comprehensible to others and often accepted by others. And if we reach different judgments, we don't just have to throw stones at each other. We can have a kind of moral discourse about it and try to find common ground and see if we can go from there. And he says, well, these are just human capacities. So it's only possible if we would now say, part of our nature means just genetically determined. And it's like a grammar, so the term moral grammar is not unreasonable. Some fixed set of principles that yields consequences that we use all the time, like when you and I are talking and understand each other, more or less. It's because we share internal principles that produce that allow us to interpret and understand novel expressions that are appropriate to situations but are not caused by situations. Crucial distinction. Big issue in the seventh. That's the core of Cartesian philosophy, for example. Hume was picking it up from that background. So there has to be a moral grammar. And furthermore, it's got to be shared. Humans have fundamentally not evolved in any meaningful way since they left Africa, maybe 50,000 years ago. Superficial changes, skin color, things like that. But as far as cognitive and moral capacities are concerned, there's the slightest evidence of any change. You take a child an infant from a Stone Age village in Papua New Guinea and raise him in London, he'll be indistinguishable from anybody here in speech and moral judgment and everything, which means that we're all basically identical. And it's, in fact, known that a genetic variability among humans is extremely slight as compared with other animals. And it's pretty obvious reasons for it. Modern Homo sapiens is a very recent development, maybe 100 or 200,000 years, which is just nothing on the evolutionary scale. And there was a diversity in Africa, but only one strain survived, the ones who came out of East Africa maybe 50,000 years ago, 75,000 years ago. Now, maybe it's a little more complex than that, but something like that is apparently true. So there's no possibility, really, of any significant variation. So it must be shared among all of us. And if there seem to be sharp differences in moral judgment, for example, or cultural practices or languages, it has to be superficial, because it must be that fundamentally it's all shared. Okay, then comes the empirical problem. Let's try to find out what it is. And in fact, there's interesting work on that. There's a book coming out from Cambridge Press, University Press, by John Mikhail, who's actually a former student of mine at MIT, who has done very good work on. Part of his work was a critique of the critical analyses of John Rawls. Rawls, when his theory of justice, very famous now, he originally took this point of view. quite explicitly. But he came under such attack from philosophers that he kind of dropped it and pursued other things. Well, Mikhail reviews the critique and argues, I think very effectively, that it has no grounds, and argues that Rawls should have kept with that kind of grammar-based model, and then he develops it. And he also began to do experimental work with some of the experimental psychologists at MIT on trying to test moral judgments from infancy on, and also comparatively. And by now a lot of others have been doing it too. Mark Hauser, who's a primatologist and cognitive scientist at Harvard, has worked on this. He has a book that came out a couple of years ago called, I think, Moral Grammar, in fact. What? Moral Minds, yeah. And there, others are doing it too. And something's got to be correct about it for Hume's reasons. But to try to find it out is not so simple. It's pretty hard to find out anything about insects. And humans are not only far more complex, but we're barred from doing the experiments that would teach us something. Like you could learn a lot about human capacities if, for example, you could raise infants in controlled environments. Okay, we don't do that, fortunately. But if there were a lot of Mengeles around, we would do it and we'd probably learn a lot. And you can't do invasive experimentation with humans. So you can't stick electrodes into the brain and figure out what the cell is doing when you do so and so. We happen to know a lot about the human visual system, but that's because it's almost identical to the visual system of cats and monkeys. And we do allow ourselves to torture them, maybe rightly or wrongly, but we do it. So yeah, you find out a lot about the visual system. But there's no comparative evidence possible, and very little comparative evidence in these cases, because there aren't any other organisms that have the moral and linguistic and other faculties. It's some unique thing that developed somewhere in East Africa, maybe 100,000 years ago. And there's nobody else around. Maybe it developed many times, but humans also happen to be a pretty savage creature. And right through human history, way back 1 million years ago, large animals disappear when proto-humans show up. And whatever might have been around in Africa is gone. The Neanderthals hung around until maybe 30,000 years ago, but that's about it. So there's basically no comparative evidence, and you can't do invasive experimentation. You can't do the experiments that come to mind, like say raising infants in controlled environments. So you have to find pretty indirect ways to try to study these things, language, moral grammar, and so on. But I think there's pretty good reason to believe that there's something critically important there. This violates the assumptions of almost all of contemporary philosophy. For example, one dogma of contemporary philosophy, it really is a dogma, is that there cannot be rules that you're following that are not accessible to consciousness. Now that has to be false. Nobody has any way to access whatever's governing what you and I are now doing. But it's a dogma that it can't exist. Not for Hume. He was willing to accept it. And those things and there's also all kind of doctrines in the, say the postmodern literature that says everything. It says social construction, it all differs, and so on. So that has to go to the extent that it's comprehensible. Not a big problem for me because I don't understand it, but and a lot more, But I think Hume had his finger on the answer.
Thank you. We've run well over time. You've been very generous.